You're listening to One Free Family, a new take on peaceful parenting, where you can hear ideas for helping to raise free, independent, and peaceful children. Visit onefreefamily.com to connect and listen. Here are your hosts, James and Taylor Davis.
Welcome back to One Free Family. This is Taylor, and you might notice that there's no James. James and I are starting to branch out and interview more guests, and sometimes it's just more convenient to do it without each other because somebody has to watch the kids. And I also think sometimes we just don't need both of us to do these interviews. So today, I am really excited to be interviewing my friend Kelly Halldorson. I met Kelly when I moved at some point after I moved to New Hampshire, and she has been just a really, really good friend to me and a really excellent mentor for me for some challenges that I've gone through in my life. And she is also an unschooling mom of grown children. So I know a lot of you are going to be jumping up and down because you always get our young child perspective. So I know that we have some listeners who have teenagers. So I think her perspective will be really helpful. She's a mental health coach and she does a lot of amazing work in this world. We're going to talk about a few things. And I think namely, I'm going to ask her a lot about navigating difficult relationships in your life through the lens of unschooling and the relationship that you want to have with your kids. So welcome, Kelly.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here, and I adore Taylor.
Oh, so thank you so much.
So I'm thrilled to be able to talk
Kelly
to you.
and I haven't actually seen each other in a while, so we had to spend an hour, 45 minutes talking before we even started this episode. And I said welcome to her, but we're actually in her really beautiful office in a very historic old building in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it's just lovely in here. So Kelly, can you maybe first just talk a little bit about, I guess let's start first with what you do kind of for work and what your mission is in the world, and then we'll talk also a little bit about unschooling and your family.
I do mental health coaching, and I also do a lot of volunteer work in that same area where I work to help people navigate difficult situations with relatives that have mental health issues, and working with the system and advocating for themselves and their loved ones, and just really working on communication between their loved ones and themselves, and that the system that is just so in dire need of change.
The mental health system.
Mental health system, absolutely. I also do work with some parents that for parenting coaching as far as helping guide toward unschooling approach and that sort of thing too. But
okay.
That's more of just a little bit more of a lighthearted side.
Okay.
To balance it out.
The lighter piece.
Yeah, the lighter piece.
And then how about your family, if you don't mind? Whatever you want to share a little bit about your family and maybe how your family kind of got on the unschooling journey. If any of you are diehard follow unschooling people fans on here, you might know Kelly a little bit if you found the Unschool Bus and followed her. She's the Unschool Bus mom. I think I actually knew you from there first before I came here. So yeah, if you could just share a little bit about how and why your family came to unschooling and maybe what that looked like for your life.
Oh, absolutely. So I had always had a dream when I was a teenager that I was going to have 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, and
wow.
and live off in the woods, and it was just going to be wonderful, and I was going to homeschool them. So that didn't exactly happen, although I got the 2 boys and a girl in that order, which I should say now they are 24 is the oldest, 22 and 21. That's their current ages. And so I had them pretty young. I was 21 when my oldest was born. And we were living in another part of the country, but we moved back home. So we moved back here to New Hampshire. Okay. And I think that it's hard sometimes to follow through with what you view in your life as what you want the picture you're painting for your life when you're around family that aren't necessarily supportive of these alternative choices. So we ended up sending them to school, to 2 separate private schools. And it wasn't until the oldest was completed 5th grade at a private school and my youngest was in 2nd grade that I got up the courage to pull them out and homeschool them. I had just gotten a job at another private school and was going to very academic focused one, very in the area that was, and I was going to try to feed them all into there one by one. And, and it was just, I went, this isn't the life that I want for them. And I was dealing with my middle son who would not do homework. So he'd already, they were all younger. So they all were young in their age group. So they all had full birthdays. So they started early, technically. And then my middle son also skipped a grade. So he was like super young, and he would pass all the tests. He would do really fantastic. But he wouldn't do the homework. And so he would get really, and then we'd have these battles. And I just watched my relationship with my kids deteriorate over trying to force them to do homework that I didn't even necessarily agree with.
Right.
Not just the concept of it, but the material of it even.
Oh, like even the things they were being asked to do and learn about it.
Yeah. And that's how it was. So I decided to take them home, and that very quickly, it was the first I was going to do a very academic focused, but that was within 2 months. I joined a local homeschool group and met an awesome woman who had older kids named Miriam, and Miriam Clyett, and her kids were 5 years older, like older than my oldest, and they were just amazing, and they'd never been to school, and they were like so incredible. And she was unschooling. She was mostly unschooling.
Yeah.
And I just was, oh my word, this is it. And
this was that picture I had in my head.
That was the picture I had in my head. And so I very quickly turned into that. You know, we shifted to an unschooling perspective. My husband was he wasn't on board. He kind of just wasn't there. He wasn't paying attention. He was in his own world. But I was very focused and very with the kids. I mean, and it started with a project it all started with a couple political projects that were just random. There was a local man doing a protest for puppeteering without a license.
Okay.
And he requested somebody to make puppets for him. So
that's awesome.
And he was going to do a Henry David Thoreau parade, or it's not parade, sorry, play in Concord in the State House. And I went, guys, do you want to do this? So we made puppets. We made a video. We went up and watched it. We learned about Henry David Thoreau. We talked about it. And that was the beginning. I was like, look at all this learning.
Right.
And all we did was make puppets.
And we're living life and participating in the real world.
And it was so awesome. And it grew from there. We just did other things. And once I saw the learning unfold, I was just hooked.
Yeah.
I was hooked. And once I saw the relationship improve with all the kids, I expanded it into the other parts of my life and our other parts of our relationship.
Can you say a little more about that? Like when
Yep, absolutely. So a little bit more about that is I expanded it into their other parts of our life.
Yeah.
Like with eating and with video gaming, with television, things that I was more restrictive with and concerned about beforehand. I watched how they were learning from all of those things too, and how it strengthened our relationship. And video games, I allowed them that space, and I would play some with them that I was interested in. But if it was something like that I wasn't, I would find other ways to connect with them about it, like going to get a video game or something.
Sure. Yeah. I think what I'm hearing is like two main things that kept you going on that path, or two main things which are really big ones for James and I too, that were so encouraging, were the learning that you saw happening, right? The learning just in living life and doing things that are exciting and fun and interesting intrinsically. And then the relationship piece. That's like, if you are listening to this and you listen to a lot of our shows, you're probably sick of hearing me say that for me, that's like top level priority. And I can always, when I'm feeling myself get stuck or I'm questioning or doubting, I always go back to like, what next decision or way of being is going to build up my relationship with my kids or support it, as opposed to put up a barrier between us or cause it to crumble a little bit. Not that you can't build it back up, but that's like my compass. So those two pieces, it makes sense. Like when you started seeing those two things happening, you were probably encouraged to keep going.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that you just pointed out another thing that I say to a lot of people, and I say this in talks or when I just taught a course about video gaming.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people look at unschooling as unstructured, right? Or that it lacks any kind of structure, that it's just free for all, that kind of thing. And I really turn that inside out, right? I think that unschooling is incredibly structured. It's incredibly rooted, and that structure is the internal skeleton that is the relationship. And it is the foundation for the whole thing.
It's so grounded in that.
It's so grounded. And it goes right up through and grows up through every piece of it. And that's very structured in a different way.
In a totally different way, but I love that you can use the same word for it. Like there's this really solid structural foundation that you're building for your family and for your kids.
Exactly. It's a core.
Yeah.
It's the skeleton. It's what everything else is built on.
Yeah, and I also think when you say people look at it as this free-form thing, that it's so interesting that there can be like freedom and structure, right, at the same time, and they both exist there together. And actually on the last episode, James and I talked so much about this approach in the sense of people worry about the lack of structure sometimes or question it. And how what they don't see often, the people who are skeptical or unsure, is along with that, the type of structure you're talking about, the relationship, is so much involvement from us as parents, right? It's not like we are all waking up in the morning and ignoring our kids all day and letting them just do their thing, right? I mean, we're giving them space to pursue the things that are interesting to them. And sometimes that means they're doing it like for a little while by themselves, but we are so intimately involved with their process and ready to feed whatever new interest comes and to ask them about what they're working on. And it's a lot more hands-on, I think, than a lot of people think, but there's just it's not hands-on in the way that you are taking a boxed curriculum and walking your kids through it. It's like hands-on in the way that you as a person have to like intimately know your child and know what makes them tick and help them thrive, if that makes sense.
Yep, and maintain that strong connection. So I've always thought of, a lot of times people get really worried about reading and stuff, or math. Or for us, math wasn't, my kids were a little older, me and my daughter in second grade, but so they all knew how to read. But
they got that from school.
They got, I'm not sure that they got it from school, actually.
Good point. Yeah. School and life.
School and life, because they got it at different ages.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. However, people do worry about math. And so there's two things that we did a lot of is my husband and I talked math aloud all the time. So I never worried about it. I remember we would drive around and I'd be like, so how big do you think that is? And how many of this could you fit in with the, it was just a constant conversation. So I never really worried too much about that. And they always had somewhat of an interest. And my middle son had a natural ability. My daughter was very interested. But the reading, one thing I would get hung up on was I'm like, well, there's all these required reading books that I didn't read in high school. But I still felt like I needed to make sure that they knew this material,
this
for
literature
pop culture and all that sort of thing for people asking questions. And so what I would do, and since I had a strong relationship with them, is I would just sit down and I would just start reading out loud. And my kids would just come and sit.
They'd just gravitate towards you.
And sit. And I read aloud to them up through the teen years. And I read aloud to my husband. And so it'd be like I would just read whatever I was worried they weren't getting.
Right. You know? Just sit down and read.
And they'd just be like, I didn't force them to. I didn't, whatever. I would just start reading aloud and they'd be like, oh, what are you doing? And then they yeah. And then it happened with other things too that I was interested in. Because if you have a connection with your kids, and you're doing something and you're interested in life, they want to know what it's about too. Just as much as I want to know about what they're doing.
Right. And it all goes back to that connection. Like they feel really deeply connected to you and they trust you and they don't worry that you have some ulterior motive or you're going to try to kind of make them accomplish this task, right? Like they just really, really feel rooted in that relationship. That was a really cool thing happened the other day. A couple weeks ago, birth doula and I came home from being with a family who was having a baby. And my kids know what I do, and they probably know more about the female reproductive system than most kids at this point, and maybe the male one too. But they, for the first time, for some reason, my oldest son, who's 8.5, really wanted to know everything about what happened. And of course, in my head, I'm like, okay, confidentiality, I'm going to stay vague here because this is not my experience. But I was able to do that. But it was just so much fun to just have him come in and sit down and just be like, and mommy, how did it go? What was it like? And I don't know, that can totally happen if you have kids in school too. It was just that connection that he felt and that I see mommy is so passionate about this thing and this work that she does, and I want to understand it more. So that was cool.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So I think that it would be helpful when we're thinking about kind of, you talked about it being hard to kind of make this alternative choice in the face of more traditional family who was around you, whether that was, maybe you can tell us if that was certain relatives or if it was your husband or both. But I'd love to, I think a lot of our listeners struggle with this, like how to stay firmly rooted in these decisions and how to kind of navigate our relationships with people who are questioning what we're doing and maybe even questioning our kids about what's happening. So I'd love to hear some thoughts.
Right. Well, those are two, like the kids.
Yeah, we can maybe
separate,
do that next. Oh, and before you talk, I think I should say the reason that I really wanted to talk about this with you was for everyone else to know is I took a class with Kelly in the summer. Was it last summer?
Yes.
And it was called Navigating Relationships with Difficult People. And so I went to the class to help me figure out how to navigate my relationship with my dad, because my dad has mental health issues and it's a challenge to navigate that. And I got so much out of it when it comes to my relationship with my father, but I also ended up getting so much out of it when it comes to my relationship with my kids. And not because I think my kids are difficult people, but because there are moments when things that they do or ways that they are acting feel difficult. Mm-hmm. And I just applied so much of what I learned to my relationships with them. So I was like, oh yeah, this will be really powerful for the people listening. So.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I actually feel like it's kind of the way I deal with it, mm-hmm. and would suggest dealing with relatives, we'll say, mm-hmm. is, I mean, I think by the time that I ended up unschooling, that I had made a choice and people were going to accept it. You know what I mean? Like I was going to be, this is, I don't need to explain myself kind of thing.
Okay.
I don't think that would be the way I deal with things as much now.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Because there's a little more resistance there, and that's not appreciating where people might be coming from or what their legitimate concerns are. So
you're saying more like when you made that choice, you kind of just made it clear of like...
I just made it...
Yeah.
And it wasn't even that I was doing it cruelly or anything. It was just, I was just like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I need to do this.
Yeah.
And with the family members... There was some pushback, but that happened with my relationship too. But I want to try to stay focused. So what I would say with managing the relationships with family members in particular, or friends that aren't particularly supportive or they're overly pushy and questioning, is to first come back to an understanding that they're probably very well intended. Mm-hmm. And they might have legitimate concerns, you know, especially to them. Yeah. And to approach that with compassion. Mm-hmm. And so when you're in relationships, say that's a parent that's just, you shouldn't be doing this, or they have to go to school, or what's wrong, or all that kind of thing, to apply those unschooling principles of that relationship structure to that relationship as well. And to be validating as far as what their concerns are. So if they're like, they really need to be in school, you know, why aren't they doing this? Or, you know, what about socialization? You can be like, I can tell you're really worried about that.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, this is a different choice. I can understand why you might be concerned.
Yeah.
Instead of defaulting to a defensive role.
Yeah. It's really powerful.
Yeah. And it's really powerful to do.
Yeah.
And the impact is because what happens is then they're not put on the defensive. And you're not trying to control how they're thinking.
Right.
You're listening and being with them where they're at and hearing them. And sometimes that's all it takes.
Yes, I know. I think it's sometimes surprising. Like you gear up for this big fight and then you see what some validation and compassion can do pretty quickly with some people.
Right.
Yeah.
Not everyone.
Yeah.
Some people, you have to keep up with that validation, and then you have to work on things yourself to fuel yourself so that you're able to manage it. Because sometimes there are relationships that are going to be a consistent struggle. But they can always be improved.
Right.
There's always room for improvement. Always. I'm like, well, maybe not. And I'm like, no, there's always space for some kind of improvement. And if there's not, even if that's just pulling back for a little bit and getting yourself fueled up so that you can go back.
That was actually one of the things that I took away from just spending time with you and talking with you about this, is like Because I started to think about, okay, these difficult people in my life, I want to be compassionate and I want to validate them, but at what expense to myself, right? And what are my boundaries? And then you kind of made me see like, oh, you can step back for a time, but it doesn't mean you're like cutting all ties and you're done forever. I don't know why I had this idea in my head, like of this binary, right? It was like, I'm all in with them or I'm out forever. And that permission to just step back and fuel myself and my children and my relationships with them and then come back when I felt more ready was really helpful. Yeah. I think that would help a lot of people.
I think I think it's just a bigger version of that in the moment thing, you know, like, so say you are you're having a discussion with somebody and it's getting heated, right? If you take the moment to just go inward and breathe, just that little bit of space can shift the whole direction of a conversation. So in a bigger concept with a bigger relationship that's having challenges, giving yourself some space and looking inward and fueling yourself by doing some kind of physical activity or gratitude practice, mindfulness, that sort of stuff. Then you're able to come back with a different perspective, hopefully with a beginner's mind.
Right. And you don't even, I think a lot of times when you do that, when you make the decision to kind of step back and take care of yourself for a while, you can't guess what you're going to come back at it with. Like you said, it's like you come back to it and all of a sudden you have all of these new ideas and this new outlook that you never could have had if you hadn't given yourself that space.
If you hadn't taken the pause, you know, and whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
I was teaching just this week, 2 times, must be a thing, is about radical acceptance, which is a much bigger concept.
Yeah.
But it's that understanding of accepting where you're at. And then when you do that and you really truly deeply accept and understand where things are with a relationship or with a situation or whatever, there's space opens up.
Yeah.
And you have all these different ideas. It's not about giving up. It's just accepting where things are.
Right. Like this is where it is now.
And then things that you hadn't even thought of just appear kind of magically.
Right.
And that sounds very wooey, but it's kind of what happens.
Yeah, it is.
Not that wooey's bad. I'm just saying.
We love it.
All right.
So what about...
No judgment.
No, yeah. What about... Well, I don't know. Is there anything else to say about that before I...
I think that validation, so like dealing with people that are struggling, is I think with your choices. I think that the core is focus on the relationship and how important that might be to you or to your kids.
Right. If it's somebody important in their lives.
Somebody important in their life, and how you modeling the best you can as much as you can, not beating yourself up for when you don't get it right.
Sure.
But recognizing what your piece of the transaction in the relationship is. So that validation, that compassion, and really looking at it from more of a beginner's mind and encouraging them. You're not there to change their mind. You're there to hear them and fuel yourself.
So that I'm so glad that you just said that, because I think what a lot of times people come up against when they're making an alternative parenting choice or education choice with their kids is almost trying to figure out how they can convince their loved ones to get on board. And I just think that's a really, really hard goal to set for ourselves.
I think, and if they're not, because think about it just in the concept of schooling. Like if your kid's not receptive and they're not intrinsically motivated, they're not learning it. And so it's the same thing with your relatives. It's that same, what is the metaphor with the marshmallows throwing it at the head or something? You know, like, I don't know. It's like something like it's not eating. It's like...
I know. I can think of... I know what you're talking about.
I have no idea who said it, but who the original person was. But it's that idea that you're going to be able to... Like, you're living this life where you're trying to... You recognize that your kids are going to learn more and they're going to understand more and they're going to trust what is right for them and all of that, but you're not doing that with the other people.
Right.
You're trying to make them understand.
Right. And I think it probably happens more when people are newer to unschooling, because a lot of times I think we have to convince ourselves that it's the right choice because we've been so schooled.
Right.
So I know, like, I'll say we've basically been unschooling for life, but still, like, we came around to these ideas when our oldest was 1. The longer we do it, the less I care really what what concerns other people have. And I don't mean that in an unkind way. I mean, like, the less I take that on for myself and let it, because I think for a lot of people, sometimes our family members' thoughts about it, like, shake our own confidence. And that's why we want to convince them, right? We're like, okay, if we can just convince them, then they'll stop shaking my confidence, whether we consciously realize that or not. But I do think it's so powerful to, like you said, again, just go back to that relationship and be able to honor where they are. And then the cool thing is, I think we've seen this with a lot of people, when you keep living your unschooling or gentle parenting life with your kids, when you live it in a way that's authentic to your family, some of your skeptics, they just actually start to see what's happening, right?
And they become your cheerleaders.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, they really just start to see, I mean, none of James or my parents have ever been super critical of our choices, but they've definitely had questions and asked questions, and they may still have some questions, but they also now have had 8.5 years of, like, seeing what this life looks like. And I think to some extent they actually kind of get it now, right? They see what's happening. They see how much our kids are learning and thriving and being uniquely them. So it really, they do, I think, it's again what we want to do with our kids, right? We just kind of model what we're living.
Okay. And there's that other piece is, because truly the only person you can control is yourself. And even sometimes that's hard.
Yeah. Sometimes that's the goal.
Yeah, that's the goal.
But we've got to forgive ourselves when we can't, right? But yeah.
And then I also thought of another piece in that is I realize also, and I just want to say this, validate people listening, that I realize that sometimes that the relationships come with baggage. So maybe if it's a parent, and the parent hasn't been supportive of you throughout your life and all of that, and so you're even more wanting to convince them that you're what you're doing is right and that you are okay and that you are worthy and all of this other stuff. And being able to recognize that that's wrapped up in there.
Yes.
And then also being able to come back and look at the relationship from a different perspective and see how you can improve it.
Right.
Yes, they should have been there for you. Yes, they should have been better. Yes, you should have had a better life. All of that. And you can make changes.
Right.
You can make changes.
Yeah. Which is really powerful to recognize, because I think understandably so, it's easy to get stuck in what happened to us in the past. And I think you're right. For a lot of people who grow up in a very traditionally schooled mindset, we want to, like, we've been kind of raised not to disappoint and to please and to do what we're told. And so when we make a really radical choice, you can feel like, oh, I'm going to lose the approval, right? And that's like that baggage that you're bringing with you. So I'm glad that you kind of called that out. And that's also, I think, a call, like you said, like, you can make a shift in the relationship now, this many years later. And that, I think, kind of calls people to work on their own stuff, right? Separately from being in conversation with that person. Does that make sense? Like,
absolutely.
Work on your own healing, because you can't change what happened and you can't change that other person, but you can continue to do the work to process those experiences for yourself.
And you can change the relationship.
You can change it now. Yeah.
By changing yourself.
Yeah.
Just that piece, by definition, is going to change the relationship.
Exactly.
That's it.
Yeah. It's cool stuff.
It is.
So what about thinking about, like, I think sometimes people struggle with other people in their lives when they perceive that these people are being in relationship with their kids in ways that they wish they didn't. Does that make sense? So maybe you've got, like, the uncle who's always, like, quizzing your kid at dinner, right? Your unschooled kid. Or, so it could be on that academic end, or it could be on just, like, maybe you have the grandparent who's not quite as gentle with your child as you would want them to be, or a little more punitive. Do you have any suggestions for people to navigate that?
Yeah, I think that there's a few ways to deal with that. Like, so what we did, and because we had a number that I would say that I almost dealt with that more than my own issues.
More like how they related to your kids?
Yes, how people related to my kids. I had... So there's one, and I adore her. So I don't want to sound like it, but my aunt had 3 kids the same age as my kids, and this is a little bit before we unschooled, but then also continued after. We're just much more strict. So we would go to bigger family events that weren't at her house or at other people's, and my kids, I was more free with their food. and her kids had to eat very specific things on a plate. And then there was expectations that my kids needed to do the exact same thing. And I worked on it at first. Like I started to try to like, oh, okay, they need to. It wasn't working, and I like also
trying to get them to fit into that when you were there.
Mold.
Yeah.
And also, I was also looking at it from like a logical perspective. Like, so they were having to eat these mashed potatoes with like, from a health perspective of like, you know, with like, not gravy, but like all kinds of just not very healthy food.
Right. You're like, why am I trying to make my kids
eat this before they could have the fruit salad?
Right.
You know what I mean? Because that's the dessert.
Right.
And I would, so at least like when I was able to step back, first I made a decision that my kids, I talked to them beforehand and sort of said, this is an issue for their kids because they're not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So can we have some compassion for their kids?
I love that. Yeah.
It's got to be hard for them to see you just having to eat the fruit salad and not having to eat the other thing. So can you keep that in mind? You know, we talk about that. And they were pretty receptive, actually, about that. And then also, I would say to my aunt, you know, finally I would just say, you know, I love you, but I'm really feeling silly making my kids eat this, which look at it, it's not really particularly healthy before they can have this.
Yeah.
And do I also want them to have to eat all of this food? So they're overstuffing. I understand. I'm not asking them to have the pie while you're eating the food.
Right.
We're waiting.
Yeah.
So we would work that kind of thing. You
and
know,
how was she receptive?
Yeah, actually, it got pretty well because I did it gradually, over
right? Like bit
years.
by bit.
Yeah,
and it's probably also nice to be able to do that instead of having it like always be the elephant in the room, right? Like my kids aren't doing what the other kids are expected, but we're not really going to talk about it, so it's going to be awkward. And I
thought it was, and I also when I talked about it, I wasn't making any judgment to her. I'm like, I understand this is how you're doing it.
Yeah.
And to me, I have a hard time because of this seems silly to me. I get it's not saying you're silly.
Right.
I'm saying to me, it doesn't work. I don't want them to feel like they have to eat everything on their plate. Yeah. There's other stuff that I am approaching differently. Yeah. And since she's a wonderful, awesome woman.
Yeah.
You know, it was gradual. I'm sure it was very frustrating at the start. And have to be true to my own kids.
Right.
And my
like
parenting is.
And coming back to, like when you said you made the decision, coming back to checking in with your priorities and realizing like this just didn't align with your family's priorities. And sometimes I think we're so scared of discomfort that we won't kind of just broach the subject, and maybe working with that a little bit too can be helpful.
And saying, I understand where you're at. I'm not comfortable forcing my kids to do this. Yeah. I'm not making a judgment on you. This is just for my relationship with my kids. Yeah. That doesn't mean to say like if they went to her house, they had to eat the stuff first, you know, and I wasn't there. Right. But we would talk about it with the kids beforehand and be like, she's probably going to have it be like this. Yeah. Are you going to be okay with that?
And they got to decide if they were okay with it.
They got an understanding beforehand before doing that sort of thing. So I think that's another way to deal with stuff like that, is to really keep that open dialogue with your kids. And that comes back to the relationship again. Yes. And I think that can happen even very early, very young. Certainly by the time they're teenagers, they're very, very clear on how they feel. And they will say things. Hopefully nicely to adults.
but I think in a sense, when we include them and we talk to them, like we empower them to be confident and to speak up when something is important to them. I think I like what you said too about them kind of giving them the space to make the decision of like, if you go over there without me, this might happen. Is that okay with you? Because I've also learned that there are going to be certain people in my kids' lives who do not maybe like act exactly the way I would act with them or the way that I would want them to. I mean, we don't deal with that very much at all, but it's happened. And at first, my initial like instinct was to just be like, wrap my kids up in a bubble and get them away really fast. And now I've really learned that like, I can help my kids make decisions about what's worth it and what's not, and what feels kind of worth, like what relationships or what experiences feel worth it enough to maybe be in a space with somebody who maybe doesn't respect their autonomy to the level that we do or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all those things are important. And so when you're having that dialogue and you have that relationship, it just keeps, it evolves naturally. I've been in sometimes it'll happen that you won't be there. You'll be in another room and something will happen. And since you have this conversation, you have this dialogue that's open, in this relationship, the kids will be like, hey, I noticed that. And so-and-so wasn't allowed to do this. And it really made him feel bad. And then they have whole conversations with you about what their perceptions of a child-parent relationship are. And they're like, that's really kind of sad that happened. And you can explore that. You know? And sometimes they'll surprise you too, and they'll be like, well, I did help him get this, or it did,
they'll see it from a different perspective or something.
And then you'll be able to like, oh, would you like us to do things that way? No, but I see why, So there's whole conversations that can happen, and learning, and you as a parent learning. And it's awesome.
It is. I think just the conversations, especially as my kids get a little older, are one of my favorite things that have come out of living this way with them.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this before we started recording, and we've had this question come up a few times, and we don't do a very good job of speaking to it because gratefully, James and I are both so on board with this alternative lifestyle. Do you have any advice or thoughts? I mean, based on what you've already said, I can make some guesses about what you might say, but for dealing with a partner, your co-parent who is not understanding or on board with unschooling.
I think it is incredibly important to really, really meet that other parent where they're at. To really, more than almost any other relationship besides your kids. Yeah. If it's co-parenting and you're in separate houses and there's not possibility of ending up divorced or something like that, I'd say something a little different, which I can get to. But if you're in a marriage or you're in a partnership
and you're parenting in the same home together,
in the same household, and you realize and you come to this epiphany that unschooling is, this is what we're going to do. Yeah. Which is kind of what I did.
Yeah.
And my relationship was not the best. My husband struggles with mental health issues, and we didn't even have it narrowed down to what was going on. So upon reflection, this must have been like, what the hell is she doing?
Right. It's like really destabilizing for him.
Yeah. He says like he looked back and put a lot of trust in what I was doing, but he didn't have any clue at first. Yeah. I mean, well, I don't think that was the core of what made things more difficult. I know that in relationships that can be. Yeah. Especially when one parent really has very particular about how they think kids should be raised. Right. And unschooling is very different from that. So it's to come back to that place of really, really, really remembering that you love the person, that all the wonderful things about them, remind yourself of those things through gratitude, and even if it's just in your own mind, and use that to fuel you so that you can look at the whole relationship as important. Right. And how do I validate them for what their concerns are? Because they love your kids too.
Right. Again, it's not coming from an ill-intentioned place.
Right. They're concerned, or they have things that they need to get over, or baggage or perspectives. So it's that really doubling down on the validation piece and really working with respect, and then softly showing the way. Don't give them
likely after quite a bit of validation, right? Right. And then continued validation throughout.
Yeah. Give them a stack of books and go, please, you have to read this. You have to read this. You do the validation. You do the listening. You listen to the concerns. You work on your marriage. You work on supporting each other in their individual things that don't have to do with the kids as well. And you work on yourself. And then you bring in pieces. Yeah. So you build that trust. If there's an opportunity where your kids are doing something really neat, or they learn, and you get to say, and he's like, oh, how'd you do that? Or he looks really happy about watching the kids, or this could be reversed. It could be the father. It could be she. But say your partner is having experience with your children, and you're watching it unfold, and it's really beautiful, and you can see that they're in awe of something, because that always is going to happen. Yeah. Then just come back around after and talk about that. Say, oh, I noticed you were really thought that was great, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I didn't know that they knew about this.
Right.
And you'd be like,
how often does that happen, right? Like, how did you know that?
Yeah. And then so you can expand on that piece. But you find those little tiny pieces. You remember the patience, you remember the validation, and you really work on it.
Yeah.
And think about the sweet things that you can do for that person. And I know sometimes it feels like, oh, I'm doing it all.
Yeah.
And the only person you can control is yourself.
Right. Because even if you try an alternative, it's still you doing it all, right? It's just instead you are desperately trying to convince somebody to believe in something that like they're so far away from that it's not going to work.
Yeah, you want to be more effective, right? You want to
if you're going to be putting in the time and energy anyway,
let's make it effective.
Right, that makes sense.
And let's make it happy. Okay, like so what is the worst going to happen from you giving love and support and encouragement to your partner in life?
Right.
I mean, how is that really going to negatively affect you?
Right.
However, you just insisting that they understand something, or you getting discouraged and frustrated and all, or responding reactively. Is that effective?
Even if they don't come around for quite a long time, if you, I can imagine or just guess that if you're showing them that level of love and empathy, that they're going to come around and show you the same thing in maybe even in the form of like, okay, let's do this. I don't get it. I don't really even want to be doing this, but it's like that way of being in relationship is only going to also, not that we can control them, but it's much more likely to build a relationship where they're then willing to trust us to kind of try this out, this unschooling thing.
Absolutely. And I think that in my relationship, that's sort of how it unfolded. So we had a mental health component, which is, shifts things up quite a bit. So I was unschooling them for a while. And I say I because, like I said, my husband was mostly outside and doing things. And then we had a point in our marriage where he had left and he was having a breakdown. And what brought us back together, though, was that compassion and that understanding and all of those things that I expressed to him. Yeah. And forgiveness for a lot of stuff and trying to figure things out and things. But even he will say that had I had not extended that and looked at the relationship as something important, just from a friendship perspective. Yeah. So not even as far as the romantic perspective. At this point, I was just like, even if we're going to be split up, I'm going to be co-parenting with this person. I want my kids to be okay with alone and all of these things. Yeah. That became the focus and the core. And then through the modeling and then also addressing mental health stuff. Sure. He is now validates me. He encouraged me. He was like, and then we got a bus and traveled around the country. So he dove right in. Yeah. Whereas from a very academic mind or sort of mind perspective, sometimes I'm like, I don't know if he really gets it. Like sure. Like he might not totally. He didn't. He definitely didn't totally grasp it for a long time. Like, so we would go and talk at unschooling conferences and people would ask him questions because they always asked the dad, I felt like. And sometimes I'd be like, okay. He's a separate person for me. It's not quite what I think of it. That kind of thing. However, he was open to learning, and now I think he has a good understanding. It's so funny, still every once in a while describes it in a way I'm like, what? Is that what you think? That wasn't my experience. That's not or just uses terminology like teaching or child learning or just more of that kind of stuff that I don't, which is totally fine. Right, and that's another piece of it too, right? It's like understanding that each person is going to have their own perspective. And that actually brings a lot of richness, I think. I think about that with my kids and the relationships that they are going to have with different people in their lives. And not every one of those relationships is going to be what my relationship looks like with them. And gosh, we have great relationships, but that would be really boring, right? For them. And they wouldn't learn much about just being in relationship with different kinds of people. So there's a lot of richness, I think, in like our various perspectives as well. Oh, I definitely agree. It definitely played out that way. And the more positive and encouraging and the more supportive and loving you can be to your partner, the more likely they're going to come around, and you're going to be more effective in your communication and in your parenting. Yeah. So we'll probably wrap up in a few minutes, but I could just go ahead and say, take everything that Kelly just said and apply it to your relationship with your kids, right? Like everything she said about dealing with other people in your lives. But do you have any kind of
suggestions or ideas for people for parents who are listening to this who want to support their children in gentle, non-punitive ways when they are dealing with either like a challenging behavior or a big blow up from a child, or maybe a child who consistently is blowing up, asking for a friend, I swear. But do you have any, I mean, I know that's like a huge topic and it could be a whole different episode, but maybe just building off of what you're saying about dealing with other difficult people. What about when our children are feeling difficult and we want to stay in relationship with them and help them, but we're also maybe feeling ourselves like floundering and maybe frustrated?
Right. I do. I think it's building on that same concept of really focusing on, and also with kids, they're your kids. I think that they're younger. Yeah. And so appreciating that they don't have all the tools yet either. I mean, grown-ups don't either. But particularly, kids don't always have the tools to express themselves the way they might want to when they reflect as adults.
Exactly.
And that's easier for us to do sometimes. Sometimes it's not. So it's to take the time, to take that time, to take that space to really look at where you're at in each moment. And to not, if you get things wrong, quote unquote wrong, don't beat yourself up. You know, apologize. That doesn't mean apologize every day, because then it loses weight.
If you notice you're apologizing every day, there's some deeper work to do.
Exactly.
Sure.
But own up to your legitimate mistakes. Talk to your kids about it.
Yeah.
And love them. Just love them and be there and be there for yourself.
Yeah.
And I know I haven't like talked a ton about that, but I really think that your own, and I don't like the self-care, like buzz phrase there. However, I think it's incredibly important to incorporate a physical practice, a spiritual practice, and that can just mean a purpose. That doesn't have to mean anything more.
Right.
It could just mean what you're here to do right now in life. That's totally self-defined. Or it could mean something else. It could mean something bigger.
Right.
And then also a mind, body, spirit, basically. So then also working your brain.
Right.
So like a practice of the mind. All of those three components. And sometimes things can do both in a practice. Like meditation, can certainly do mind and body. And spiritual, or I think that those things are crucial to find time. Not find time. Don't find time. Make the time. Make them priorities in your life. And again, if you miss it, don't beat yourself up about it. Just come back to it, because there are always chances to do it again.
Yeah,
there's always chances.
There's always a new day.
And you'll be really surprised, even with little kids, even in life that's busy. If you choose one thing to be a priority for yourself, so say, like for me, I go to yoga every single day. I'm like, I get up in the morning, I'm like, what time am I going to go to yoga?
Right, that's the thing that doesn't get pushed down to the bottom.
I figure out how, and if I can't go to it, I do it myself.
Yeah.
Or I go twice the next day.
Right.
I make it a thing. I realize sometimes people feel awkward about doing it for themselves. That was certainly a problem for me.
Yeah.
So what I started to do when I started doing that, I'm like, I'm not going to yoga for myself. I'm going to yoga for people around me.
For my family and the people around me.
Because I am more in a place of loving kindness and support and patient and all of those things when I'm fueled.
Right, because it's when we think about our kids presenting us with challenging moments or challenging behaviors, it's almost like our logical brains know what we would do, right? Or how we would want to handle them. But if we haven't taken care of ourselves to the place where we can stay in our logical brains, then it's really hard to not let ourselves get kind of, at least for me, get worked up in those kind of like tense situations. Whereas if we are taking care of ourselves, we have those tools more readily available.
Yeah. And it can be as simple as making sure you're eating, you're making sure or if you're not doing those things, recognizing that you haven't. So like if you're in a struggling, you're in a situation where your kid's having a hard time and you know that you're not fueled. You know that you haven't done the things you want to do. Going, oh, wait a minute, I'm not very fueled.
Yeah.
I should walk a little more carefully.
Tread carefully, or disengage if that's going to feel okay for the kid and come back to it later. Or like, we don't need to win any battles, or walk away, quote unquote, right?
Right. How do we not make things worse?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's it.
Sometimes that's the best we can do. And actually that's really good, actually.
Yeah. How do we not escalate? How do we not make things worse? That's all right. We can come back and make things better.
Yeah.
You know, like if we don't have the energy to do that now.
Yeah.
You know.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we'll have to have you back sometime, because there's like a million more questions that I could ask that I think would be really helpful to our listeners. Is there any place that people can connect with you if they want to?
Yes. I'm in constant revamping.
I know you're kind of building some new things right now.
But Facebook is definitely
just your name.
Just my name.
Okay.
Just my name.
Kelly Halldorson.
Yeah.
Yeah, you actually post so many great things that always make me think, and then the comments there's always so many great, conversations that are happening. So sounds good. Facebook is the place to connect.
Yeah, and I think Instagram too, people can reach me there. Facebook, I have both a personal profile and a regular page profile. So either one.
Okay, maybe we can link to them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. And I'm thinking in the future, maybe even like a conversation about more focused on teenagers or something, but
I would love that.
We'll come around to that.
I totally think unschooling teenagers is definitely different than...
It has to be, and we just aren't there yet in our own experiences, and we do have some folks in our group who have at least some of their kids in those years, and so that would be awesome. Okay, well, thanks for joining us, and thank you all for listening, and just remember that each moment is a new opportunity to be the parent that you hope to be. And I'll say for James, since he's not here, love you guys.
Thank you for listening to One Free Family. If you enjoy the podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron at onefreefamily.com/support. Your support will help make this show better. Plus, you can get access to rewards and additional episodes by joining. Again, that's onefreefamily.com/support. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.